So good afternoon. It's Dominique Gilliard, and I serve as the Director of Racial Righteousness and Reconciliation for the Love, Mercy, Do Justice mission priority of the Evangelical Covenant Church. And today I am with Tamara Fore and Darnella Melancon, who are going to explain to us the impact that COVID is having on Indigenous communities. And they're going to talk about it both within the context of reservations and beyond. And so I just am so thankful for the opportunity to interview you both and get a greater understanding of what's happening, why it's transpiring, and how we as the broader body of Christ can actually step up and support you as Indigenous brothers and sisters in the midst of what's going on right now. So I'm going to actually have both of you kind of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about who you are and where you are and kind of the way in which you are leading in response to what's transpiring right now.
So my name is Tamara Fore-Ravelo, and I have the privilege of serving at Salem Covenant Church in Washington, D.C., Connecticut, as one of the leaders there. And my response has been to help facilitate getting tangible goods to the reservation. And we'll talk more about that later, as my church has been very supportive in leading these efforts.
Okay, hello. I'm Darnella Melancon, and I actually am tuning in from the Fort Yuma Quechan Indian Reservation. We are actually located in Winter Haven, California, but we also border on the Colorado River with Yuma, Arizona. Also, part of our reservation boundaries line up with Mexico, Alcadones, Mexico. So my role out here, I am a tribal member, but I have a history of serving in the community as a tribal council member, and back in 2012, and then many different roles in the community service realm and social services, community health, and most recently, I just was appointed to the Board of Commissioners for the Kwuh-tsan housing, and more importantly, I've served as a minister out here for years. And so my take in the community, I just recently moved back out here from Sacramento last year, after having been away for about 6 years. So I think I'm in a unique position to have an impact in not only the community issues, but how the church can help in a better way, because there's lots of factors that come into play when ministry is not successful on the reservation, and I've witnessed that. And so I believe God's called me back to be somewhat of a facilitator and a liaison to churches and other faith partners to be able to help in a way that's healthy and that's actually impactful and effective. So thank you for inviting me on.
Yeah, no, this is critically important. When initial diagnoses were coming out around racial disparities, there was a lot of attention given to the disproportionate impact COVID was having on African American communities. Then we heard a little bit more about how it was impacting Latino communities. And we are now learning the depth of impact it's having in Native communities. And I think it's really important for us to really center this conversation, because all too often the concerns of our Native and Indigenous communities fall to the wayside and don't get the proper attention that they deserve. And so I really am excited to kind of hear from both of you. Specifically, how is COVID impacting our Indigenous communities right now?
Okay, so this is Darnella, and I'm tuning in by audio. I'm actually taking a break from my job right now to tune in, because I believe this is critically important. And before I answer that, what I want to talk about is, when you think about how COVID is impacting Native American communities, you have to look at how tribes are different in so many ways. There are actually 573 federally recognized tribes or reservations, and spread out throughout the United States. And with that, every tribe is unique in itself, different dialects, different languages, different cultures, different subcultures. So you're not going to really have, for the most part, two tribes or tribes that are identical. You have unique issues, you have unique peoples, unique family dynamics, but there are a common there's a common thread amongst all tribes, I believe, that has caused the impact to affect tribes in a unique way. And so looking at the size of the tribes and how many members the tribes have, how the financial position of the tribes, all these come into play. And so even when you look at sovereignty on the reservation and how the tribal leadership and tribal governments enact, the constitutions. Most tribes have their own constitution. And with that, part of that is the health and the welfare of the community, which really comes into play when you look at COVID. What is sovereignty? And when you look at what happened back when tribes were developed and reservations, when Native Americans were pushed onto reservations, and then the treaties were signed, and some of them broken, many of them broken and not honored. You look at where we are today, systems for tribes, and originally tribes were given sovereignty to have a say in what happens in their communities with their people. But as I've experienced growing up on a reservation and being part of the government on the reservation, it's not always what it seems. And I think that's important to look at. How sovereign are we? Are we really sovereign? For the most part, I believe tribes are actually domestic dependent nations with some form of sovereignty, but not actual true sovereignty, because we rely on the government for support. And most tribes are not independent of the United States government. We rely on a lot of grant programs to provide for our people, our social service programs, our educational programs. Most of those are funded by the government. And with that, you have grant guidelines and different things that subject the tribal leadership to the rule and the leadership of the federal government. So I just wanted to throw that out there just to say that is a major factor when you look at a city or a state government. Those monies are they're given directly. A lot of times the tribes are left out because of the dependency on the U.S. government. Well, if the federal government gives out money to a state, you may have 100 plus tribes that fall into that state. For example, for California, there are over 100 tribes alone. Actually, California represents a state that has more tribes and reservations than any other state in the country. Now, you might look at Oklahoma and like the Cherokee Nation, now those, and the Navajo, as being tribes that have large numbers of indigenous people, but the number of reservations and tribes, California is actually a state that has many. So if the government pushes out funding to a state, most of the time the tribes are not counted individually. So if you have 100 plus tribes, now the government has to look at, okay, how are we going to divide this $8 billion or whatever it may be to all these tribes? And so that's where some of the issue comes from. And so, for example, our tribe we have 2 casinos, one in Arizona and one in California. Now, when the quarantine hit and the requirement for quarantining hit, the tribes were forced to close their doors, which is a major economic source of economic revenue for the tribe, and also employs a lot of tribal members that were also laid off. So that's one example of how COVID is impacting Native communities. It's a financial impact, and then also sharing of information, as some of the leaders and governors have direct communication with the president on how these funds are pushed out. Tribal leaderships are kind of pushed to the back, and they're kind of the last to get the information, the last to get updates on how to apply for funding. A lot of tribes recently, when the funding was given out, the deadlines were so close to when the tribes were actually notified that some tribes didn't even have time to prepare to apply and present whatever was necessary to apply for monies. And so I don't want to go deep into that. But I did want to bring that background and history up for how it impacts financially, not just health-wise, but also financial. The financial impact has been great. And then the issues of unemployment and even the tribal administration being shut down partially because we rely on that money to fund other programs for our tribes. So I don't want to go into any other areas. I just wanted to speak to that. And I don't know if Tamara, if you wanted to add anything else.
I think you pretty much covered it all. What I will add is that, you know, even without the pandemic, life in Native American culture is very difficult. Having lived there and that being my family and experiencing all of that. And then when we look at how the COVID-19 is impacting Indigenous populations, they're not even counting us in that number. So when they put out reports and saying that, oh, the numbers are down, or this is what's going on, for instance, like in Arizona, saying it's not impacting it as bad, the Navajo are right within that population. So when you say, when they don't count us in the numbers, then it makes you ask the question, does Indigenous really matter? So then if you're not counting us in the numbers, then you fail to count us in the resources. And that, like Darnella said, has a big impact within itself.